They told you monsters are born in shadows, lurking in dark alleys and distant prisons. But what if I told you America's youngest monster wore the face of a child, only 12 years old, and his crimes were so unspeakable that even hardened men of the 19th century recoiled in terror? Imagine Boston, 1871, a city drenched in fog, gas lamps flickering against cobblestones, slick with rain. Beneath that civilized surface, something ancient, twisted, and almost inhuman was stirring inside the body of a boy named Jesse Pomeroy. He was not large, not intimidating, not what you expect when you hear the word killer. Yet behind his pale eyes there was a coldness, the kind of cold that doesn't belong to a child. His gaze unsettled adults, made animals twitch, and sent whispers through his neighborhood. But no one could yet imagine the truth, that Jesse had already begun a silent war against innocence itself. There are stories in history that are meant to be hidden, stories so grotesque they're softened, rewritten, or buried under polite pages of history books. Jesse's story is one of those. He is not just a boy who killed, he is the forbidden reminder that evil does not wait for age, that darkness can bloom in the smallest vessel, and once it does not care about rules, morals, or even the natural limits of human empathy. It consumes, it spreads, it manipulates. Think of the world you know, governments, schools, churches, courts, all telling you that innocence is protected, that children are sacred, that evil has a predictable face. Jesse Pomeroy shattered all of that. At 12 years old, he forced a society built on Victorian illusions of morality to stare into a mirror that reflected their own weakness, the inability to comprehend how corruption, cruelty, and hidden agendas seep into every layer of existence. His crimes were not just murders. They were messages, written in flesh, whispered by a force older than he was, a force that uses people as instruments, even children, to show humanity just how fragile its illusions really are. This is not a story of a boy. This is a story of a system unprepared for the truth. A system that punished him, but never silenced the echoes of what he represented. Tonight, you will descend into the darkness of Jesse Pomeroy's mind, his crimes, and the institutional failures that followed him. But be warned, once you hear this, you can never unknow it. Before Jesse Pomeroy became a name whispered in horror, he was simply a child born in Charlestown, Massachusetts, in 1859. But even at birth, he carried the marks of something unusual, something nature itself seemed to etch into him, his right eye was clouded with a milky film, leaving him with a stare that felt less human, more predatory, a gaze that adults avoided and other children mocked. His lips twisted unnaturally, his face asymmetrical, his expression unsettling even when he was silent. Imagine being a boy in the mid-19th century, surrounded by religious neighbors who believed deformity was punishment, a visible brand of sin. Jesse learned early what it meant to be treated like an outcast, and outcasts either break, or they harden into something unrecognizable. By the time he was 6, Jesse wasn't playing the games normal children played. While others built toy boats or chased each other through Boston's alleys, Jesse practiced cruelty. He found stray animals and experimented with them. He inflicted pain, not in bursts of rage, but with chilling precision, as if testing how far life could bend before it broke. He wasn't clumsy about it. He studied suffering like a scholar studies a text. That should have been the warning. That should have been enough to tell anyone watching that this child was not just troubled, but society looked away. Parents scolded, neighbors gossiped. Yet no one wanted to admit the possibility that a child, a boy, barely old enough to hold a school book, could embody true malice. Children in Jesse's neighborhood whispered about him. They avoided his stare, avoided the alleyways he wandered. They called him the boy with the evil eye, and still, he was allowed to walk free, unnoticed, uncontained, even as his fantasies grew sharper. You must understand, Jesse's story isn't just about one boy's descent into darkness. It's about the blindness of institutions, the refusal of a society to see what it doesn't want to see. When corruption is too young, too disturbing, too out of place, it is easier to ignore than confront. And by ignoring Jesse, Boston opened the gates for something unspeakable, because within just a few years, his sadistic games would no longer be limited to animals. He would move on to his true obsession, other children, and what he did to them would scar the city forever. It began quietly. Boston, 1871. Neighborhood children, boys between the ages of 4 and 8, started disappearing for hours at a time. When they returned, if they returned at all, they carried wounds they could barely describe, cuts, bruises, rope burns, terrified eyes. And yet their parents, embarrassed by what had happened, often silenced them. Who would believe that the boy responsible was not a grown man? Not a shadowy stranger, but a pale, awkward 12-year-old named Jesse Pomeroy. Jesse's method was calculated. He lured younger boys with promises of games, or coins, or simply the strange authority he carried in his gaze. Then he led them into the marshlands near Boston, into abandoned sheds, into the quiet places where no one would hear them scream. There, he unleashed the fantasies that had been festering inside him. He bound them, he whipped them. He used knives, sticks, even hot coals. And the most chilling part was not the violence itself, but the way he watched their fear, studied it, fed on it, as though every whimper was a lesson in control. By the time authorities took notice, Jesse had assaulted nearly a dozen boys. Each child carried the same haunted expression, the same silence born not just of fear, but of humiliation. In a society obsessed with reputation, many families buried the truth rather than expose it. And Jesse understood that silence. He knew shame was his ally. It allowed him to keep hunting while the city turned its face away. But make no mistake, Jesse was not improvising. His cruelty was systematic. This was psychological warfare, conducted by a 12-year-old against children, even more vulnerable than himself. Think about that. Before he was old enough to shave, before he was old enough to vote, Jesse had already mastered the mechanics of terror. He didn't just want to hurt, he wanted to dominate. He wanted to prove that he could control another human being, body, mind, and spirit, simply because he desired it. And the city, with its courts, its schools, its churches, allowed him to walk among them. They called him troubled. They excused his actions as childish cruelty. But what Jesse was building was not childish at all. It was a blueprint, the beginning of something far darker. This was no longer a boy experimenting with pain. This was the birth of a predator. And predators, once they taste power, never go back. By late 1871, whispers about Jesse Pomeroy had become impossible to ignore. Too many children had returned broken. Too many parents had complained in hushed tones to the police. The brutality was escalating. And so finally, reluctantly, authorities acted. Jesse was arrested. 12 years old, a boy in a courtroom, his pale, cloudy eyes staring at the judge with a strange detachment. Not fear, not regret, but the cold satisfaction of someone who had tested the limits of society and found them weak. The evidence was undeniable. Multiple boys testified. Their stories aligned. The ropes, the knives, the burns. Each account was a thread in the same tapestry of horror, and every thread pointed directly at Jesse. Yet when the gavel came down, what did justice decide? Not prison, not exile. Not the kind of punishment adults would receive for such crimes. No, Jesse was sent to a reformatory, a juvenile detention center, with the hope that discipline and Christian guidance would cure him. Here is the truth most people never learn. Jesse's first arrest was not the end. It was the beginning, because the system chose to see him as salvageable. They believed the illusion that children, no matter how monstrous their actions, could be molded back into innocence. They thought he was just misguided, just a troubled youth who needed structure. But Jesse knew differently. He knew the punishment was light. He knew adults were too afraid of what it would mean if they admitted a child could embody pure malice. And so he learned something powerful, that society's rules were negotiable, that authority was not iron, but paper. For over a year Jesse was confined in the reformatory. He read the Bible. He memorized prayers. He pretended to repent. But inside, his fantasies sharpened. Every day of confinement was not a cleansing, it was incubation. He was studying human behavior, studying authority, studying the blind optimism of men who thought they could reform him. When he was released in 1874, Boston thought it was welcoming back a reformed child, a boy who had been corrected by discipline and God. But the truth was darker. Jesse had learned to mask his hunger. He had learned patience, and he was ready to escalate. They believed they had fixed him. In reality, they had forged him. In 1874, Jesse Pomeroy was released from the reformatory after serving barely a year. He was just 14, a pale, lanky boy, with that same cloudy eye and the same twisted smile that unsettled anyone who looked too long. Officials claimed. He was rehabilitated. His mother welcomed him back, convinced her son had been redeemed. But beneath the surface, Jesse was no longer experimenting with cruelty. He had refined it. His fantasies were no longer about domination alone. They had escalated into visions of killing. Only months after his release, the first body appeared. It was a 10-year-old girl named Katie Curran. She vanished after stopping at Jesse's mother's store, and though her disappearance was whispered about, no one immediately suspected Jesse. Days passed. Parents grew anxious, then weeks, and finally, Katie was found, her body hidden in the basement of that very store. The horror of it was unmistakable. She had been stabbed, mutilated, discarded like an object, and Jesse's mask of reformation shattered. But the city wasn't finished with him yet, because Katie's death was only the beginning. Within weeks, another child vanished, this time a 4-year-old boy named Horace Millen. The search for him ended in an empty lot near the shore, where his body lay in the mud, his throat slashed, his small frame bearing the signature marks of Jesse's sadism. And once again, Boston faced the unthinkable, that the same boy they had believed was cured was now killing with more precision, more ferocity, and with absolutely no remorse. What you must understand is this: Jesse Pomeroy's murders were not accidents of rage. They were deliberate, ritualistic, almost ceremonial. He lured his victims the same way every time. He led them away from safety, isolated them, stripped them of control, and then destroyed them. And when the final blow came, it was not about silencing them, it was about completing the cycle of power he had created. At 14 years old, Jesse had become something no one in America had ever seen, the nation's youngest serial killer. And suddenly, the story could no longer be silenced. Newspapers called him the boy fiend. Ministers declared him proof of evil incarnate. And the city that had ignored his early signs now scrambled to comprehend how a child had managed to unleash such terror. But Jesse understood. He always had. Evil, when ignored, does not vanish. It evolves. Boston in 1874 was a city under siege, not from an army, not from a foreign power, but from a boy. The murders of Katie Curran and Horace Millen tore through the city's illusions of safety. Parents clutched their children tighter. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Newspapers spread panic with every headline: the boy torturer, the child murderer. Jesse Pomeroy's name became a curse, whispered in the same breath as the devil himself. But what terrified people most was not simply what he had done, it was that he had done it at such an age. Evil was supposed to wear the face of hardened men, not pale children with clouded eyes. The manhunt that followed was swift. Authorities searched every corner of the city. every alley, every marsh where Jesse once lured his victims. And yet, when they finally brought him in, there was no resistance, no madness in his demeanor. Jesse sat in silence. He admitted nothing at first, but his presence alone was enough. Witnesses, timelines, the evidence all converged on him. When pressed, Jesse confessed in fragments, coldly, without shame. He described the killings not with rage, not with sorrow, but with the detached tone of someone describing the weather. It unsettled even the most hardened interrogators. They weren't facing a child. They were facing something else, something that looked like a boy but spoke with a void where empathy should have been. Was this nature, nurture, or was it something darker, something ancient that had found a vessel in a child's body? In the courtrooms, whispers spread. Jesse was not merely a criminal. He was cursed, possessed, a living embodiment of evil itself. Ministers used his name as proof that sin infected even the youngest. Psychologists, a new profession in the 19th century, debated whether Jesse was insane or whether he was proof that insanity could exist without age or experience. But here is the forbidden truth. Jesse was more than an anomaly. He was a revelation. He showed a society, still hiding behind its churches and schools, that corruption doesn't wait until adulthood. It seeps into life wherever it finds an opening. And Jesse, with his deformities, his isolation, his growing obsession with power, was the perfect opening. Boston wanted to believe it had caught a murderer, but what it had really uncovered was a mirror, a reflection of its own ignorance, its own failure to confront the shadows lurking within every system. Jesse was not just one boy. He was the exposed nerve of a civilization pretending innocence was safe. The trial of Jesse Pomeroy was unlike anything Boston had ever seen. A boy of 14, thin, pale, with one milky eye that never seemed to blink, standing in a courtroom meant for grown men. The benches were packed. Journalists crammed into the aisles. Ministers, doctors, and ordinary citizens came not only to see justice, but to confront the unthinkable, that a child could embody a cruelty beyond comprehension. The prosecution laid out the evidence, the testimony of survivors from his earlier assaults, the timeline of Katie Kern's disappearance, the discovery of Horace Millen's mutilated body. Each fact fell like a hammer, but Jesse never flinched. He sat with a strange calm, his expression unreadable, as if he were watching a play unfold, and he, not the judge, was the director. Doctors were called to the stand. They debated whether Jesse was insane. Some argued his violence was the result of disease, of hereditary madness. Others declared him fully aware of his actions, fully in control, and therefore fully responsible. But the more they argued, the more the city realized something chilling. The experts did not agree on what Jesse was. Was he a criminal? A lunatic? A child warped by deformity and abuse? Or was he something altogether different? A new kind of predator? No one had words for yet. And all the while, Jesse listened. Not with guilt, not with fear, but with curiosity, as though the debate over his soul was a form of entertainment. Witnesses described how he smiled, faintly, when details of his crimes were read aloud. How his one good eye seemed to gleam when the word murder echoed in the chamber. The verdict was inevitable. Guilty. The crowd erupted not with triumph, but with unease, because condemning Jesse Pomeroy did not end the questions his existence raised. What do you do with a killer too young for the gallows, yet too dangerous to ever walk free? How do you punish evil that wears the mask of a boy? The court's solution was simple, brutal, and symbolic. Jesse was sentenced not to hang, but to life in solitary confinement. A boy of 14, condemned to spend the rest of his days in a cell barely larger than a coffin. They called it justice, but others whispered it was an experiment, to lock evil away, to watch it grow in the shadows, to see what becomes of a child when you bury him alive. And so the cell door closed. But the story did not end. It was only beginning. The cell was 6 by 8 feet, stone walls, an iron bed, a slit for light that barely reached the floor. That was where Jesse Pomeroy, 14 years old, began his sentence of solitary confinement, a punishment so severe that even hardened adult criminals often broke within months. For Jesse, it was meant to be forever. No companionship, no laughter, no touch of the outside world. Just silence, stone, and the sound of his own breathing. Imagine it, a boy entering manhood, not through the chaos of adolescence, not through freedom, not even through punishment in the traditional sense, but through total erasure. Day after day, year after year, Jesse's world shrank until it was no bigger than the space between his bed and the wall. Time itself became meaningless. Days bled into nights, seasons into years. The only constants were isolation and memory is a dangerous companion for someone like Jesse, because while his body was confined, his mind roamed free. He replayed the cries of his victims. He studied them in the silence, sharpening them, savoring them. Guards reported that he would stare into space for hours, as if reliving moments no one else could see. At times he spoke aloud to no one, muttering, smiling faintly at invisible conversations. And yet, disturbingly, Jesse never fully unraveled. Many thought he would go mad, babble nonsense, collapse into insanity. Instead, he remained sharp, calculating, controlled, as though the solitude was not destroying him, but transforming him. Visitors came, doctors, journalists, even ministers, drawn to this living paradox. They wanted to study him, to understand what kind of creature could survive decades of isolation without breaking. Jesse often obliged, speaking calmly, recounting his crimes without emotion, describing his imprisonment as if it were a laboratory where he was both subject and scientist. One doctor remarked that Jesse's mind was cold fire, burning, but without heat, consuming without ever exhausting itself. But the truth was darker still. Jesse became more than a prisoner. He became a symbol, a living experiment in control. Authorities pointed to him as proof of their power. Look, they said, we can lock away evil forever. But beneath that lie, another truth stirred. Solitary confinement was not justice. It was a weapon, a system designed not just to punish one boy, but to test how silence, isolation, and psychological control could reshape the human mind. And Jesse Pomeroy, America's youngest serial killer, was their perfect test subject. The years passed, first 5, then 10, then 20. Jesse Pomeroy remained in his stone box, the youngest prisoner in America, condemned to solitary. By the time he reached his 20s, Boston had changed. Factories multiplied, railroads stretched further, and the city grew noisier, more modern. But Jesse remained frozen in time, a boy locked away, who was now becoming a man. The world outside evolved. He did not. Journalists called him the boy who never grew up, but in truth, he did grow. His body elongated, his voice deepened, his hair grayed. Yet his mind, twisted in isolation, remained anchored to the crimes of his youth. When interviewers were allowed inside his cell, rare, but always sensational, Jesse spoke of his past as if it were not past at all. He described Katie Curran and Horace Millen with a strange detachment, as though he were narrating a play someone else had performed. And yet, when pressed, a flicker of pride always bled through his calm tone. Pride in what he had done. Pride in the fact that the world still spoke his name. Doctors visited too. They studied him like a specimen. Was Jesse insane? Was he the product of disease, heredity, or deformity? Or was he fully sane and simply evil? The debates filled medical journals, lectures, and conferences, but no consensus came. Instead, Jesse remained a question with no answer, a boy who had grown into a man, but a man who was not fully human in the way others were. The public, meanwhile, was divided. Some argued that Jesse's sentence was too harsh, that to confine a child for life was more cruel than any execution. Others insisted it was too lenient, that Jesse deserved the rope, and nothing less. And through it all, Jesse endured. He ate his meals in silence. He walked the perimeter of his small cell like a caged animal. He aged, but he did not vanish. He became a living ghost, a reminder that punishment itself can become its own kind of cruelty. But here is the truth. Most people overlook Jesse was not just a criminal. He was a test case, a symbol. The state had locked him away not only to protect society, but to experiment with power. They had proven something, that they could erase a person without killing them, that a human being could be buried alive, consciousness intact, for decades. And that, perhaps, was more terrifying than the murders themselves. Jesse Pomeroy was no longer just a boy killer. He was a monument, a warning carved into stone, of what happens when society decides to make an example of you. The courtroom itself became theater. The press filled every corner, scribbling notes, hungry to turn each word into headlines that would sell 1,000 copies by morning. People craned their necks, desperate to see the boy at the center of this storm. And there he sat, Jesse Pomeroy, pale, expressionless, his one good eye locked forward, unblinking. Witnesses described him as empty, as if he were a vessel carved out for cruelty alone. When the charges were read: kidnapping, torture, murder, the crowd expected denial, some plea for mercy. Instead, Jesse listened with the same detachment one might give to the reading of a grocery list. He confessed in fragments, coldly recounting how he lured children, how he inflicted pain, how he watched. But what unnerved the public most was not the crimes themselves, it was his utter lack of remorse. Judges debated whether a boy could even comprehend such evil. Ministers preached about the devil's influence. Doctors, fumbling in the infancy of psychology, whispered theories of madness. But still the question echoed louder than all the rest. What is he? A child? A monster? Or something born to remind the world that evil can come dressed in youth? And while the court weighed justice, the newspapers sharpened their blades. They did not merely cover Jesse's trial, they elevated it. They branded him the boy fiend, the child demon, a creature so unnatural that even the walls of a prison might fail to contain him. And the people believed it, not because they had seen Jesse's crimes with their own eyes, but because the story was too powerful to resist. A new archetype was being born in America, the child predator. Jesse Pomeroy was no longer just a defendant, he was a symbol, a warning, a myth in the making. The verdict arrived with the weight of inevitability. Guilty. The word echoed in the chamber. But for Jesse, it seemed to mean nothing. He neither flinched nor pleaded. He simply sat, as though judgment belonged to another world. The jury recommended death, an unthinkable sentence for someone barely past boyhood. But the governor hesitated. Could the state truly execute a 14-year-old? To hang him would set a precedent, darker than the crimes themselves. And so, the decision twisted into something far crueler. Jesse would not die, but he would live out his years inside a cell no larger than a coffin. Life imprisonment, solitary confinement, day after day, year after year. The boy who once roamed Boston's streets was now trapped in a stone box, his only company, the silence pressing in from every direction. Newspapers described the punishment as merciful, but some whispered it was worse than death. Jesse grew older, but never grew out of the monster the public believed him to be. He became a living specter of Fiera, reminder that evil could be born from innocence, that childhood was not always a shield against darkness. Outside the prison, mothers still told their children to behave, or the boy fiend would get them. Inside, Jesse's legend only grew. The longer he survived, the more he ceased to be flesh and blood, and the more he became something else, an eternal cautionary tale. The prison walls swallowed Jesse whole. For decades, he lived inside a cell, barely larger than a Gravis world, reduced to stone, iron, and shadows. The authorities kept him in near total isolation, fearing he might corrupt other inmates, or, worse, find a way to kill again. The boy who once prowled Boston's marshes grew into a man without ever truly touching the outside world. He spent his days pacing the same few steps, carving strange symbols into the walls, whispering to himself in the silence. Some guards said he read obsessively law books, the Bible, scraps of newspapers smuggled in. Others swore he spoke of freedom as though it were still within his grasp. He filed countless petitions, arguing that his punishment was cruel and unusual, that he had been too young to deserve such a fate. But every appeal was denied. To the world outside, Jesse Pomeroy was no longer a child, but a legend of terror. People barely remembered his face. They only remembered the fear. The prison became his coffin long before he died. Yet even in that suffocating solitude, Jesse refused to vanish. The longer he endured, the more he became a ghost that haunted Massachusetts, half man, half myth, a reminder that some monsters are not slain, but buried alive in silence. Outside the prison walls, Jesse Pomeroy's name grew into something larger than his crimes. Newspapers whispered about him like he was a curse that Boston could never shake. Writers called him the boy fiend, the young demon, America's youngest serial killer. His story drifted into penny dreadfuls and pulp magazines, exaggerated until fact and fiction blurred. Some painted him as a beast born of evil itself. Others claimed he was proof that society had failed to control its own children. Ministers warned their congregations about him. Mothers invoked his name to frighten misbehaving sons into obedience. And yet, in strange corners, Jesse attracted a morbid fascination. Criminal reformers argued he was a victim of circumstance, too young to have known what he was doing. Radical thinkers insisted he should have been studied, not entombed. His prison became a site of macabre curiosity, a place where visitors whispered, "That's where the boy killer rots." Over time, Jesse's physical body wasted away inside a locked room, but his myth grew healthier than ever. He was no longer just a murderer. He was a story parents told in the dark, a shadow cast over every discussion of childhood innocence. By the time Jesse Pomeroy entered his 30s, the boy who had once terrified Boston no longer existed. The newspapers that had painted him as a monster could not have imagined the frail figure he became. Years in near total isolation had bent his posture and hollowed his eyes. His skin grew pale from the lack of sunlight. His muscles wasted away from disuse. He developed tremors in his hands and a constant weakness that no doctor could cure. Prison guards noted that his voice, once sharp and defiant, grew soft and almost whisper-like, as though the sound of speech itself had forgotten him. And yet his mind remained disturbingly sharp. He studied law books, wrote endless petitions for his release, and crafted long letters to governors, pleading his case. He believed, or perhaps convinced himself, that his crimes had been exaggerated, that time had changed him, that he was no longer the boy who killed. But every petition was denied. Every plea fell on deaf ears. The world outside still remembered Jesse Pomeroy as the child monster, and for the state of Massachusetts, releasing him would have been unthinkable. Jesse's obsession with freedom became the single thread that kept him alive. Each year, he drafted appeals, thick stacks of handwritten arguments, citing obscure legal precedents, pleading for clemency, begging governors to reconsider his case. He believed, or at least convinced himself, that justice might eventually bend in his favor. But with every denial, his desperation deepened. Guards often found him pacing his tiny cell, muttering to himself, rehearsing the arguments he imagined delivering before a judge who would never hear him. He claimed he had been reformed, that he was no longer dangerous, that decades in solitude had cleansed him of the boyish rage that once drove him. But the petitions were not just about freedom, they were about survival. Each rejection chipped away at what little hope he still carried. The press dubbed him the forgotten man, yet the truth was crueler. He was not forgotten. He was remembered too well, his crimes etched into the public memory like scars that could not heal. Massachusetts would rather keep him buried alive than risk his return to the world. And so Jesse, once a boy who wielded knives with terrifying precision, now fought only with words that no one was willing to hear. The years of isolation gnawed at Jesse's sanity in ways no blade ever could. Prison doctors noted the slow unraveling, long bouts of silence broken by sudden, violent outbursts against the stone walls of his cell, bloodied fists striking until his knuckles split. At other times, he would laugh without cause, the hollow sound echoing down the corridor, unsettling even the guards, hardened by decades of cruelty. He complained of voices whispering at night, voices of boys he once tortured, calling his name, demanding answers he could not give. He scratched symbols into the walls, crude shapes of knives, shackles, and doorways, as if mapping an escape that would never exist. Some believed he had slipped into madness. Others whispered he was faking, still scheming. But the truth was simpler and darker. Jesse Pomeroy was trapped in a cage of his own making. His body aged, his hair turned gray, his hands grew frail. But his mind remained tethered to the violent child he once was, replaying his crimes like a cursed loop. He was both prisoner and jailer, unable to flee from the echo of his own past. Nights were the worst. In the silence of his cell, Jesse claimed he felt cold hands brush against his skin, small hands, fragile as those of children. He muttered about faces appearing in the cracks of the stone, eyes staring back at him from the dark, accusing, unblinking. Guards often dismissed it as madness, yet they too admitted unease when walking past his cell. Some swore they heard whispers, not Jesse's voice, but softer, higher, the faint sound of children sobbing. Others spoke of shadows moving against the wall when no light was near. Whether hallucination or haunting, it no longer mattered. Jesse was chained not just by iron, but by memory, by the ghosts of the innocents whose lives he had shattered. Every creak of the prison floorboards, every echo of footsteps, became a reminder that he was never alone. He had created companions for eternity, bound to him through cruelty. And as the decades stretched on, the world outside moved forward. Yet inside, Jesse lived the same nightmarish childhood again and again, trapped in an endless replay of his own evil. Outside the granite walls, Jesse's name was no longer just that of a prisoner. It was a warning, a whispered curse. Newspapers seized upon his story, branding him the Boston boy fiend and the youngest serial killer in American history. Every fresh crime in the city seemed, at first, to be linked back to him in speculation, as though his evil might reach beyond the cell. Writers and preachers alike used his life as a symbol, proof of moral collapse, of the dangers lurking in unguarded youth. Mothers frightened their children with his name. Behave, or Jesse will find you. His story bled into pulp novels, sermons, even carnival sideshows. To the public, he was no longer a boy, rotting in isolation. He was myth, a living embodiment of corruption, a devil born not in fire, but in the pale flesh of a child. And yet, within his solitary stone tomb, Jesse himself heard none of it. He did not know, or perhaps he knew too well, that while his body withered, his legend had grown teeth, sharper and longer than the blade of any knife. By the time the calendar reached the 1920s, Jesse was no longer the pale, sharp-eyed boy who once prowled the back alleys of Boston. He was an old man trapped in a stone coffin, his body eroded by decades of darkness. His legs had wasted too thin, sticks unable to carry him. He shuffled awkwardly with a cane inside the tiny radius allowed him. His eyesight dimmed, his once piercing stare reduced to a hollow, clouded gaze. Guards reported that his skin clung to him like parchment stretched too tightly over brittle bone, and yet there was something unbroken in him, a hard knot of will or perhaps simply the absence of remorse. When visitors passed through, they remarked on his strange calmness, the way he spoke softly, politely, as though he were no more than an ordinary old man. But beneath that cracked voice lingered the echo of what he had been, the boy who had lured children to their torment, the youth whose cruelty was said to stain Boston forever. His body failed, but his shadow remained intact. On September 29, 1932, Jesse Pomeroy finally died inside the walls that had held him for more than 60 years. The boy who had terrified Boston in 1874 had become an old man of 72, his name almost forgotten by the world outside. No ceremony marked his passing. No family gathered at his bedside. The guards who had watched him with suspicion for decades now closed his eyes with a kind of weary relief. His death certificate recorded nothing more than natural causes. A quiet end for a life that had once been anything but quiet. For Boston, the nightmare had ended long ago, yet Jesse's death brought with it an uneasy reminder. The city's first serial killer, the child who had forced a nation to reconsider the nature of evil, had taken his final breath not in chains, but in a bed inside a prison. Yes, but still a bed, not the gallows. Some whispered that justice had never been truly served, that the souls of his victims still wandered restlessly, denied the closure of his punishment. Others were grateful only that the story was over, that the name Jesse Pomeroy could finally fade into history. But history, as it always does, held on tighter than anyone expected. When news of Jesse Pomeroy's death slipped into the Boston papers, it was printed in small columns, almost as an afterthought. There was no sensational headline, no crowded streets, no public mourning. The city that had once trembled at the mere whisper of his name barely blinked. For many, he was already a ghost, a relic of a darker time, when neighborhoods still lit gas lamps at night and children played in alleys without fear of monsters. Yet among the older generation, those who remembered 1874, the announcement stirred unease. They recalled the frantic searches, the bodies of children left mutilated in fields and marshes, and the boy with the white, milky eye staring coldly from the courtroom. "The fiend is gone," some muttered, as if his presence had still been a shadow cast over Boston. But others wondered if death had really ended his story. Could a life spent in such violence and confinement simply vanish without leaving something behind? His name became a cautionary tale told in hushed tones, a reminder that cruelty can wear the face of innocence, that the true horror is not in monsters from fairy tales, but in children who never learned to love. After his death, Jesse Pomeroy's life became less of a local legend and more of a subject for study. Criminologists, psychologists, and prison reform advocates returned to his case again and again, searching for answers. What made it capable of torture and murder? Was it a product of his environment, poverty, neglect, bullying for his deformity? Or was it something deeper, something innate, a defect of the mind that no education or compassion could correct? Some early psychiatrists labeled him a moral idiot, a term used in the 19th century to describe children who seemed incapable of empathy. Others argued he was the perfect case study of a born criminal, supporting the dark theories of Cesare Lombroso, who believed skull shape and physical deformities could predict violence. Even in death, Jesse became an exhibit, a figure pinned down in medical journals and court lectures. His life was stripped of humanity and dissected as though he were nothing more than a specimen, a puzzle for scholars to rearrange. Yet, despite the theories and the endless debates, one truth remained: no one could fully explain him. He was too young, too brutal, too unfathomable. And that very unknowability is what gave his name a disturbing immortality. In the decades after his imprisonment, Jesse Pomeroy's story began to seep into Boston's folklore. Parents whispered his name like a warning, telling their children, "Behave, or Jesse will come for you." His crimes, though rooted in the real, took on the texture of myth, the kind of tale told to keep the young from wandering too far into the streets or woods alone. He was transformed into a boogeyman, a shadowy figure lurking just beyond the reach of lamplight. And yet, unlike most legends, Jesse was not a fable. He was flesh, he was real, and he was still alive, caged, but breathing, somewhere in the heart of Massachusetts. This made the legend more terrifying. For generations, the thought of a boy who had once been 12 years old, capable of torture and murder, lingered in the collective imagination. Jesse became a symbol not just of cruelty, but of the possibility that evil could live in the face of a child. His presence haunted not only the victims' families, but the city itself, a reminder that innocence could curdle into monstrosity without warning. Even as the decades slipped by, Jesse refused to vanish quietly. From his cell, he wrote letter after letter, to wardens, to governors, even to strangers. In them, he insisted on his innocence, on his right to freedom, as though the murders were a misunderstanding. He crafted petitions, legal appeals, and pleas for mercy that carried his name far beyond the stone walls that confined him. Each time his letters surfaced, the city felt its old wound reopen. Newspapers would publish fragments, fueling debates. Was this the voice of a wrongly condemned man, or the manipulations of a remorseless killer? His words blurred the line between prisoner and phantom, keeping his legend alive long after others of his era had faded into obscurity. By the time Jesse grew into an old man behind bars, he was no longer just a criminal. He was a ghost that refused burial, a reminder that some crimes do not decay with time, but echo endlessly. When Jesse Pomeroy finally died in 1932, the prison exhaled a silence it had held for more than half a century. He had spent over 50 years in solitary, longer than almost any other prisoner in American history. Guards who found his body said, it was difficult to imagine the frail aged figure before them was once the boy who had terrorized Boston. And yet, death did not erase his shadow. Even today, his name lingers in the dark corridors of criminal lore, the boy killer, the monster child, the fiend of Boston. His crimes, committed before his voice had even deepened, force us to confront a chilling truth. Evil does not always arrive in the form of a hardened man. Sometimes, it is born early, dressed in innocence, and smiles with the face of a child. Jesse Pomeroy's story ends with his body in the ground, but his ghost remains, not in the prison he haunted, but in the uneasy thought that such darkness could awaken again, anywhere, in anyone.